channel. So please allow us to record, which I am going to do now. Okay, I think this is being recorded. Recording has started. Thank you. My name is Nhlanhla Cyril Mbata. I'm your hosting chair for this afternoon. The ICR, for those who don't know, conducts research in 4 key areas, namely environmental resources management, skills development and education, human and economic development, and lastly, cross-border trade, especially in Africa. We therefore welcome research collaborations, especially in these areas mentioned. Now, sorry, to our seminar. With the release of the IPCC report a few weeks ago, the spotlight is once more on climate change discussions, and our efforts to navigate or to intervene positively is also on the spotlight. High carbon emissions are believed to be at the center of the challenge. The topic, especially around reducing emissions, is so political because reducing emissions has a direct impact on economic activity. Decisions to be made include choices on immediate economic benefits versus future economic costs. Not only do the majority of governments in developing countries feel disadvantaged compared to those already in developed countries when looking at proposed emissions reductions. In fact, if the US, the biggest economy, is expressing their disadvantage, as Donald Trump has illustrated this to us in the last 4 years, one can only guess the high level of fear of immediate economic disadvantage that faces both developing and the least developed nations. This is probably the one area today where the stakes are really high. These range from political costs, human and environmental costs, whose estimates it is clear we will never agree on, and mainly for political reasons. So this is hugely an important topic. Professor Gustafson's paper is helping us towards understanding the policy intervention aspect of this topic. For example, some of the questions that are being introduced and addressed include the following. What are the global emission targets? Are the Paris 2015 targets meaningful? Are South Africa's policy targets sensible in terms of the required targets? Are they fair in comparison to other nations? What is driving South Africa's targets? Would South Africa's emissions tax be effective? How would the cost of the tax or the tax burden be distributed? What are the overall risks on old and new jobs that can be destroyed or created? Do we have the skills and expertise to manage the economic transition that is required by such policies? Given these many questions to explore, Martin's paper is not really an ordinary academic paper in that sense. In many ways, it is an educational policy presentation and analysis. About our presenters, the invitation did outline the experiences of both Martin and Gray, who will be speaking to us today. Let me mention that Martin Gustafson is a visiting fellow with the Institute of Social and Economic Research ourselves. He's also an associate professor with the Department of Economics at Stellenbosch University. To sum up his skills, I would say that he's a modeling planner that is currently being used by the Department of Basic Education. He has worked in many countries, including Argentina, Spain, Pakistan, Nigeria, and Costa Rica. Mr. Gray Maguire, thank you very much for agreeing to be our respondent in your very busy schedule. Gray has immense practical experiences on the ground. He is the carbon project manager at the Climate Neutral Group South Africa. He has diverse experiences in sustainability issues, including impact investment and innovation finance. He has played a variety of roles in areas of green economy and climate change, infrastructure finance, climate, energy, food, water nexus, including land use and resources management, etc. Colleagues, We are really grateful to have you speak to us today. Some housekeeping rules. For the audience, please do post your questions in the chat throughout the discussions. We will attend to all of them at the end of the presentation. And if for some reason we do not have enough time for everybody to voice out their comment or question directly, we will read them out on your behalf. Otherwise, we would, with time permitting, would be able to enable you to speak by unmuting your mic so that you can engage the speakers directly yourself. Without wasting any further time, Martin, over to you, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nhlanhla. And afternoon to everyone. I hope the sound, all the technology is working as it should. So let's go. This is what I produced is a paper in part on Nhlanhla's insistence. I indicated late last year that there didn't seem to be a good kind of primer in many of these climate change related issues, policy issues specifically for South Africans, at least not of the kind that I was looking for, with a lot of references, etc. And Nhlanhla then said, well, produce it. So that's the product that I'm presenting today. Nhlanhla has already been through these questions that guide the document. A key question is, of course, also to what extent I need to deal with these issues in an introductory manner. I'm aware there's a whole range of people in this webinar with different levels of expertise in this area. I'm going to try and go fairly light, and I'm not an expert with many years' experience in this area, although this is something that I have been following in some detail in recent years. I'm an education economist, so my point of departure is the education system. And one way of kind of gauging how broad and how multidisciplinary these climate change policy issues are is to just look at where does this sit in the school curriculum. So whether you are a geography teacher or a history teacher or a religious studies teacher, there's something in the curriculum, in particular in the later grades, that one has to deal with. And this serves as a reminder of how really broad and all-encompassing this topic is. It's very difficult to ignore these policy issues, wherever one works, whatever one specializes in. Yeah, I mean, as I said, there are experts amongst us here in the webinar, but I think even the experts struggle with something that I know Nhlanhla is very interested in, and that is just the language and the narratives that we use to explain this to people, to explain these rather new, very complex, and in many ways life-threatening issues to an audience, to facilitate informed debate. It's not easy. So let me get into some specifics then. This is the institutional landscape, international at the top, South African at the bottom. You've heard of many of these bits in the puzzle, I'm sure. At the international level, we have the UNFCCC, which is a global treaty which has been around for almost 30 years. You would have heard of the Paris Agreement. You've probably heard that the targets are not binding. that's true. Well, there aren't targets really in the Paris Agreement, and certainly not emissions targets, but the processes that countries are expected to follow are binding. So we need to monitor certain things, we need to make certain commitments, etc. There's a commitment to conduct a global stock take of where we are at globally, but that's only happening in 2023 in terms of these international agreements. Then you have, on the more technical side, you have the IPCC, which has recently released the Working Group 1 report for the last round of assessments, and that's the physical science part. There are 2 other reports. They come in a trio, and the other 2 for this round will only come out next year. So we are still using the 2014 ones. They come out, all of these reports come out every 7 years. They're enormous. They are quite difficult to go through, but incredibly important. The one that I'm drawing most from is the last one, mitigation. And then there are a couple of other players internationally. I'll talk a little bit about the Global Carbon Project, which is close to the whole United Nations system, and Climate Action Tracker. Then at the South African level, we have the Department of Environmental Affairs, which is the custodian of the work that must be done in South Africa. And this department, in line with international agreements, has to produce 4 important things. By the way, green is analysis, whereas blue is policy, basically. So 2 analyses that DEA needs to produce are the greenhouse gas national inventory. What are we emitting? How do we calculate that? How do we use the methodologies that the IPCC sets out in calculating what our emissions are? Then we have to periodically produce a national communication. What are we doing to reduce these emissions? What are we doing to adapt to climate change, etc.? And then on the policy side, first, we have something called the NDC, a determination that we as South Africa make of our fair contribution to reducing emissions. Now, that's a little bit like saying, you know, everyone pay taxes, but please pay taxes according to what you think is a fair contribution. I mean, you can imagine the obvious problems with something like that, and I'll say something more about that later in this whole system. And then we have to produce a development strategy showing how we plan to reduce our emissions. And then Treasury and the Minister of Finance is the custodian of this relatively new Carbon Tax Act that in many ways will shake the South African economy and society in various ways. So this is a graph that tries to explain this issue of burden sharing. And this is now to deal with this question of how fair are our commitments. Well, one has to understand what is the framework that we use for determining what is fair. So in this graph, you can see, let me just get my pointer. You can see on the horizontal axis, years going up to about 2100. A lot of the planning is essentially going up to 2100 now, starting in about 1990. 1990 is an important point in history because it's considered a point at which one could expected governments to start taking action because the science around climate change was clear enough. And then you have emissions, carbon dioxide equivalent emissions per capita. I'm going to refer a few times to carbon dioxide equivalent emissions, which means taking gases other than carbon dioxide and converting them into the kind of impact that carbon dioxide has, in particular methane. Now, the graph has two types of countries. We have Annex 1 countries and non-Annex 1 countries. In the international climate policy, Annex 1 countries are essentially rich countries, and there are 43 of them. They and then the non-Annex 1 countries is everyone else, including ourselves as South Africa. And South Africa sits more or less there. So we have per capita emissions that are actually quite relatively high relative to other developing countries, somewhere halfway between the developing country and rich country averages. Now, the crux of the problem is that so much emission has already happened. So these rich countries, which today contain about 17% of the world's population, are responsible for about 60% of emissions that have happened. And you probably know that even emissions that happened 100 years ago count now, because the carbon dioxide, to a relatively large degree, remains in the atmosphere. So history is extremely important in looking at what is fair. And this is the basis for this argument that really rich countries have to take a leadership role. They need to do a lot in order to reduce global emissions. And, well, have they reduced global emissions? Yes, they have to some extent, whilst they got richer. So the size of the circles is per capita income. So they've got richer whilst reducing per capita income. And this we can think of as one kind of decoupling. There are two types of decoupling referred to in the international agreements and reports, and this is really important to understand. So on the one hand, what the international policies underline is that we need to decouple income or consumption from emissions. So we need to, as far as possible, without completely compromising our standards of living, we need to emit less. We need to learn to live in a cleaner fashion. Now, if this curve here is, what might have happened if all the rich countries had done this decoupling as effectively as some of the best countries in this group. And then there's another completely radical type of decoupling, and that is the decoupling of human well-being from income. So the argument is that why do we need to consume so much is, certainly beyond a certain point, our well-being is not improved that much by additional consumption. And in an absolutely ideal world, perhaps the Annex 1 countries would have accepted that they're actually going to consume less. Their per income, their per capita income would have declined. But of course, that's very idealistic, although it would have been ethical. So this type of decoupling, in other words, consuming less, is very, very difficult, and is often what people will fight against, and what underlies much of the opposition, say in Trump's America, to these kinds of policies. Then I'm keeping my eye on the time. The non-Annex 1 countries may not have emitted that much historically, but we've reached a point now where non-Annex 1 countries are emitting the bulk of our greenhouse gases. So a lot of the challenge currently actually relates to developing countries. And then there's the additional issue of population. That isn't even factored in here. The fact that there's population increase, and that complicates things further. And now there have been various critiques of this framework. I mean, one of the critiques, which I think is a very interesting one, comes from Thomas Piketty, the Capital in 21st Century guy, who makes this point that why are we only focusing on countries and not individuals? Because, you know, it's really about individuals that have responsibility ultimately. And he talks about the top 10% of emitting individuals, 800 million individuals producing about 45% of the world's emissions. So a small minority of individuals are responsible for almost half of emissions currently. And that's obviously very important to consider when one is looking at justice. Incidentally, amongst those 800 million, Piketty's calculations place 16 million South Africans, which would be the South African middle class defined quite broadly. Right. I spent some time on that slide because it's really important to go through these this equity, this fairness framework, because so much else, the policies, etc., depend on that. Now, one of the reasons why Annex 1 countries have managed to reduce their emissions is that they've simply outsourced their dirty production. So whereas previously these countries produced a lot of goods themselves that were linked to emissions, they've now outsourced this to countries such as China. So the emissions are happening elsewhere, but they're still consuming those same goods. So obviously a fascinating question is, how do production versus consumption-based emissions compare? So we probably all heard that South Africa is a high emission, relatively high emitting country. But it's important to also note that much of that is emissions relating to exports. So if you look at what South Africans consume, it's actually considerably lower. And here you can see the yellow and the red is the world that is, in a sense, exporting emissions, and the rest of the world imports. You may wonder now, how can Saudi Arabia be an importer of emissions if they're a fuel producer? Well, that's because they are importing a lot of manufactured goods and food that come with emissions. So South Africa is, in a sense, a high emitting exporter in this global system. All of the international agreements rest on production statistics, not on consumption statistics. So the fact that South Africa produces goods attached to high emissions, which are then exported, that's not taken into account in the international agreements. Why? Well, I mean, I think certainly one reason would be it's very difficult to do these types of estimates. You have to look at trade by goods, and of course, sometimes it's not just trade across two countries, but trade involving 3 or 4 countries as the supply chains move along. So, yeah, you might have heard of statistics such as these. In terms of our total emissions, we're the 12th in the world. In terms of per capita emissions, we're 26th. If you take into account what we consume as opposed to what we produce, these figures, we're not as prominent, or we're not as bad an emitter. Now, I mentioned previously that each country determines what they think is a fair contribution to the job, the task of reducing emissions. That was the only way we were going to get an international agreement. Politically, it would have been impossible to have an international agreement where the United Nations says, South Africa, you can only emit so much. So the compromise was, let countries work through this, and if they don't arrive at sustainable targets, then we kind of go back and ask them to redo it. And what is quite interesting is that if you look at the documentation behind South Africa's commitment, and our commitment is to emit between 2000 and 2049, no more than 28 of the 1,440 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent that the world should emit. So, I mean, 28 versus this is very small, which reflects how small South Africa is in the world. But what is interesting is that the South Africa's analysts came together with Indian, Chinese, and Brazilian analysts, and they worked together in a task group. And the South Africans came up with these figures, the Indians came up with these figures, and so on. The Indians and the Chinese came up with much lower budget figures, emissions figures for South Africa. They were far more stringent. South Africa, on the other hand, was more stringent for India than China or India was. So what this illustrates is the difficulty of a system where it's kind of up to everyone, every country, to determine what is fair. You're obviously not going to get a scenario where you have sufficient emissions reductions across the world. So that's where an organization such as Climate Tracker, Action Tracker comes in. This is probably the preeminent organization currently tracking what have countries committed to and how good or bad is the situation. And it's mostly bad. You've probably read about this. There are a few shining stars. In a recent review, and CAT doesn't cover all countries, but they cover about 80% of the world's emissions. Morocco emerged as having commitments which are good, 1.5 degrees temperature increase compatible, but virtually everyone else is worse than that. And in fact, so South Africa is insufficient. Actually, South Africa has two commitments. It's the only country assessed here which actually has two different commitments. And South Africa then says, we will achieve a reduction somewhere in between the two. Well, the two are highly insufficient and 2 degrees compatible, depending on which one you look at. So therefore, I just put South Africa into the middle one, which is insufficient. What's noteworthy is that the few sufficient, or the few 1.5 and 2 degree compatible countries that we have are all developing countries. Clearly developed countries, according to these CAT assessments, are just not had not made the commitments they needed to make by the time this report was produced. So, all right, let me watch the time. I don't want to cut into anything else. I've got 8 minutes left. So I've dealt with one of the three questions. I'm going to go faster through the other two, which is fine, because I think that the first question is probably the most complex one. How does one determine what is fair? How does one even think about these policy options? So for South Africa and other countries, we have various things on the menu to do the job. There are non-market interventions where you simply ban emissions or limit emissions. Economists and the IPCC prefer market-based interventions, because then you have policies which are less politicized, less subject to lobby groups, and you have a more efficient approach where you are more likely to make changes where the impact is high and costs relatively low. But now there are two completely different types of systems, emissions trading systems and carbon taxes. Essentially, here, government says this is how much we can emit, and then auction permits to large emitters. So the permit prices may fluctuate. In the carbon tax, it works the other way around. So government says this is the price that we attach to the emission of 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, and government tries to make that price fit with its international commitments. Of course, you can't be absolutely sure how people are going to respond to prices, so emissions are somewhat unpredictable. There are drawbacks in particular with this. Carbon taxes are generally seen to be more effective, especially in developing country contexts, but as the World Bank's State of and Trends of Carbon Pricing points out, this is now a report that has become an annual World Bank report. The emissions trading systems are relatively common, especially in rich countries. They were often created before carbon tax schemes were introduced. There are 61 initiatives only in the world, and these cover, and one of them is our carbon tax. They cover only 22% of global emissions, so we're really only starting out. The price of carbon emissions is way too low, according to the World Bank. Apart from South Africa, 4 Latin American countries have a carbon tax. Now, our carbon tax is considered exemplary. A lot has been written about it. Its design is considered good for a variety of reasons, including the fact that it actually covers 85% of South Africa's emissions. And I'm going to move, fairly fast through this. The details are in the report. But so how does this tax work? There's a tax that is paid by very few emitters. I can't remember the number. I saw the number somewhere. The number of emitting organizations is actually very low because the tax targets large emitters, preeminently Eskom, which is responsible for almost half of the emissions that are governed by the carbon tax. The carbon tax doesn't cover everything. So, for instance, farming is excluded because it's very difficult to measure basically burping animals. It doesn't lend itself to a carbon tax. So the tax payable is calculated on the basis of how much fuel you're burning, and then this is multiplied by emissions factors that are international, and you can subtract sequestrated emissions. In other words, emissions that are emitted, but then you essentially bury them in the ground. This is a technology that's still very underdeveloped, and this doesn't happen in South Africa yet, but the policy foresees that happening. You have a tax rate. Nominally, it's 120 Rand, but after you take a whole lot of allowances into account, roughly it's about 48 Rand now. Then you subtract allowances for international trade disadvantage if you are an exporter and you would be disadvantaged, and you have allowances to incentivize green investment. And then as far as diesel and fuel are concerned, now these fuels are really the only fuels that are widely combusted. I mean, anyone who drives a car in this meeting is an emitter, because you are combusting that fuel. Now that is dealt with in a special way. The tax is applied to refineries, but if in terms of the carbon tax, you need to declare it and then you deduct it. And I have 2 minutes left. So the first steps have been taken in South Africa.
A few more minutes, Martin. You can have a few more minutes.
Okay, all right. I don't like taking time away from other people. I like to stay within my budget. But okay, but let me try. So currently, officially, the carbon tax accounts for an annual revenue of 630 million Rand. If the tax were fully implemented now, if there were no allowances and exceptions, we would be looking at a much larger tax revenue. And Eskom and other large emitters are due to begin paying in 2023. So this is when we can expect to see quite serious structural disruptions in the country. The current tax rates point to an increase in the electricity price of about 4%, which is not large, but this is part of a phasing in process. Now, third question, can South Africa attain its emissions reduction targets? Now, you've probably heard of virtually all of these initiatives. So this is what is explained in these two documents of the Department of Environment. Yeah, I don't think I need to go through them one by one. I mean, I think what is worth remembering is that the reason why there's so much emphasis on waste management, it's for two reasons. Firstly, the way waste management happens currently often results in methane emissions from landfill sites. Moreover, the more we recycle, the less emissions we have associated with the things we consume. So if we recycle our beer bottle, essentially we won't need emissions to produce a new beer bottle. And then, of course, there are these softer issues which are obviously vital, leaders leading by example, and the national policy takes these things into account. How do we know what the effects of these policies will be? Well, we really have two key analyses, these two. They follow quite different approaches, and I'm not going to discuss these now, but they're in the report. So these are modeling exercises that tell us what do we have to do. And of course, a particularly important question is, what must the carbon tax rate be if we are going to meet our international commitments in terms of reducing emissions? And this is extremely important. So the modeling that we have so far points to net job creation. So these disruptions in the economy will produce more jobs according to these projections as new industries open up, solar, wind, etc. And because the carbon tax potentially means more government income, or at least a restructuring of tax revenue, there's interesting scope for more pro-poor income distribution or other initiatives that can tackle our historical inequalities, which is of course vital. I mean, one cannot divorce all of this from the country's deep socioeconomic inequalities. And yeah, so in terms of moving forward, what do we need? We need very skillful negotiation underpinned by good research, and not all of the research is that great. And I think the experts in the group would probably agree with that, and many of the experts have said that the research needs to be better. We need these international negotiation skills. There are some very, very difficult arguments that need to be made. For example, the argument around South Africa's human capital and its relationship to our ability to reduce emissions. South Africa is a bit of a star player currently. That gives us some kind of like reputational capital that we could use and build on to be a leader. I mean, leadership has been so bad up till now that it's not that difficult to kind of shine in this process. Yeah, given South Africa's democratic context, this process will be very different to what it is in, say, China. Public buy-in is especially important. We need to understand punitive measures. I mean, there are no punitive measures in the Paris Agreement, but logically, a country that does not stick to its commitments is likely to suffer punitive measures in international trade, as even boycotts. And we need, I mean, yeah, for those of us in the education sector, we are definitely not thinking enough and planning enough around the new demands for skills. I saw this interesting report that came out recently after I'd finished my report on jobs in the labor market implications of the solar industry. Nuclear. There are, we need better research to underpin the arguments for or against nuclear. I could have gone into that in more depth, but I'm not going to do that now. And of course, corruption. is part of the whole equation. The less corruption there is, the more trust there will be in the required public investment. So to conclude, there were 3 questions. Are our targets equitable? Well, they're not nearly equitable enough with respect to our future generations. We are not on track to reduce climate change within kind of manageable levels. The good policy design, yes, we've arguably we have achieved this. But translating policy to implementation is going to be not easy, obviously. Attainable targets, technically, yes. Modeling suggests that we can attain the targets that we've set. However, that's technically. Much of what happens will be political. Thank you very much for your time. Thanks, and over to you, Nhlanhla.
Thank you, Martin. Colleagues, Martin's paper, just to remind you, is available online for all the details that could not be covered during the presentation itself. And the link was also on the invite that was sent out. As Gray gathers his thoughts around all of that information, I'd just like to note that I find it very interesting that the historical CO2 lasts for that long, and it also counts. And I imagine what the implications then for that would be. I'm thinking about what the implications for that could be. It could mean that then for the nations that are not as invested in the dirty economy, the cost may be lower than maybe expected in the transitioning to a cleaner economy. Because maybe those nations have got less of an economy to destroy or to let go of. Although I'm not sure to what degree the dirty economy can hinder this transition itself. Anyway, this sounds like an interesting possible exploration for a paper, looking at specific case studies maybe. And I also think it would probably contribute to less guesswork and less fear in the political decision making, where there's lots of unknown variables. And this could also be linked to with moving from an old or dirty economy to a new, cleaner economy. What then are the implications for new jobs created versus old jobs being destroyed in the dirty economy? It's, to me, just from a knee-jerk reaction, I would imagine that there will be lower jobs to destroy in nations where they are not as invested in dirty economies currently. But in any case, it also sounds very similar to the shift of the multinational companies of the labor costs, production costs to Asian countries, when Martin is talking about when production is being shifted to other countries because the policies do not account for consumption, but more for production. And that also speaks to the redistributional effects of the policies and the taxes that, and you know, people always try to avoid or evade taxes, as they try to always avoid and evade costs, or companies do that, or people who are liable for paying taxes or paying the costs. Okay, so these are the questions that I'm now thinking about, prompted by this discussion, Martin, as we invite Gray to formally respond to the paper. Mr. Gray Maguire, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cyril, and thanks very much, Martin. Yeah, I read the paper with interest, and obviously the presentation was very interesting as well. And I think in terms of responding on it, first and foremost, I hope I don't have too much noise in the background. I've got people busy grinding away in the background, so I hope you can all hear me correctly. But there are a number of I think from a research perspective, in terms of a literature review of official policy positions, the paper accurately reflects many of the official policy positions correctly. I think that there are a number of mistruths and deliberate logical fallacies that are included in a number of the positions that inform these policy perspectives. And I'm going to speak to a number of those issues now. And in fact, I'd said actually before I started this this presentation that I didn't have any slides that I wanted to bring up. I stand corrected. There is in fact a slide I want to bring up if I can find it. There we go. Yeah. So let me know when you can see this slide. Somebody, I can't see anyone now. So if you can just somebody.
There you go. We can see it. Thank you.
You can see this. Right. I'm going to post the link to this. Well, it's not a slide. It's a presentation. This is from the CSIR. And this is from Dr. Tobias Neems-Boshoff and their whole modeling team at the CSIR, most of whom had been senior management level for electricity planning at ESCOM for many, many years. This is a 2017 study that came out. And really, if we want to bore down to the truth, the crux of much of the debate that is going on within the carbon justice and the carbon emission justice, what is fair, the fairness discussion, a large amount of it comes down to the truth of this slide. And the truth of this slide is the fact that we as a country have engaged in misrepresenting the truth behind our energy modeling and the costs associated with our energy modeling. And in fact, this paper in particular draws out in great detail how it is that we've done that. So, for example, a normal energy modeling scenario in any normal country, a base case is the position that you start from and then you policy adjust thereafter. In our case, our base case in scenario, and base case is the cheapest mechanism for being able to generate the new amounts of electricity that you want to generate. In our case, we have always begun with a policy adjusted base case, firstly. And secondly, the other part is that we've deliberately misrepresented costs associated with particular kinds of technologies. And this presentation brings it out very clearly. But what you can see here in this presentation is that the costs associated with the South African base case and with the carbon budget are in fact considerably more expensive, emit considerably more carbon dioxide and use considerably more water, also generate far fewer jobs than the policy that the CSIR considers to be the cheapest policy. So our most carbon efficient, with the least loss of load probability, I'd like to add as well. That entire model, least carbon, least cost, least water, most jobs, least loss of load probability is not represented in our integrated resource planning. That is not what it is that we've adopted. And obviously, I mean, anyone who watches the news can see that actual energy policy has got nothing to do with what it is that we do, because even the IRP, which has been based on these fallacious positions, is not being adhered to at all, which is why it is that that Gwede Mantashe has just announced that they will initiating procurement of 2,500 megawatts worth of nuclear power, which is not in the IRP. So, and this is really important to state. And I state this because really what that means is that what we've got in South Africa is and this is, Cyril made this statement earlier, and this is one of the logical fallacies that we're perpetuating in this discussion. And Cyril, I'm going to, I beg your pardon here in terms of in picking on your statement, but your statement at the beginning was that that wealthy countries have in the past had these high levels of emissions And now that we're going into a future where emission reductions are required, that is going to equate to a lower level of development. That is a complete non sequitur. It's a logical fallacy, and it's not true. As we can see, the lowest cost path for us to be able to engage in generating the electricity that we need, also considerably faster as well, by the way, I didn't mention that part. So faster, cheaper, more clean, more generating, less loss of load probability, these things are presented in the model that we've not adopted. So for us to say that going the cleaner path is going to come at our cost is completely contrary to the evidence. The evidence is that, I mean, if we look at just the facts around this, in the last round of the IPP program, Thabamiti and Khanyisa, the two coal-fired power plants that that Eskom is now failing to be able to get funding for, their cost per kilowatt hour of electricity was R1.03 per kilowatt hour. And new wind and new solar were coming in at 62 cents per kilowatt hour. That price curve is continuing to go down. So, and that's not even looking at any of the externalized costs around acid mine drainage or water consumption or any of the other factors or the health considerations of communities around them. So we're perpetuating this story, and what it breaks down to is it breaks down to the position that Barbara Creasy is taking, that in order for us to meet our national determined contributions, we need concessional finance. The developed world needs to finance us in order for us to be able to meet the climate commitments that we need to do. That line of argument, that's like a teenager saying, well, you know, even though I have a cell phone, my parents used a rotary phone, therefore I want to have the right to be able to use a rotary phone, even if it's going to radiate my brain and radiate everybody else around me. That's the same logic that we are busy perpetuating. And it's not useful, and it's not true. And also, unfortunately, you know, if we also look at what it is that our new we've now updated or put out our draft updates on our nationally determined contributions, and if we look at what those updates are, the ceiling amount that has been proposed by Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment is 440 million tons of CO2 equivalent per annum. Climate Action Tracker has us on path currently, just our current ceiling, as a result of implementing the IRP as it presently stands, that includes Thabameti and Khanyisa, at 453 million tons of CO2 equivalent per annum, which they also regard to be highly insufficient. So, you know, we keep pursuing these dirty technologies. Similarly, also speaking with nuclear as well, that modeling report, which I'm going to paste into the comments here, it does not allow for any new nuclear, by the way. It does not deem it to be a necessary function to be able to engage in our electricity planning, certainly not up until 2050. So we continue to factor in these things and say, oh, we can't possibly do without them, despite the fact that they cost us more, they take longer to implement, they pollute more, they use up more water. We're an incredibly water scarce country, but we want to continue to rely on these sources. So that logical fallacy needs to be taken out of our discourse. We need to stop this nonsense rhetoric around the fact that the just transition, as Grady Montashi says, needs to come at a pace and a scale that we can afford, as if decarbonizing was something that were more expensive. That's simply not true. Firstly, one of the things I also wanted to talk about that, you know, comes in here, and it's supported in the paper as well, is around the issue of human capital, you know, and about the fact that we need to be able to finance the human capital gap. That's you know, yes, we definitely have skills problems in this country, and certainly, you know, and I was very interested to read about the Human Development Index implications of our stalled educational improvements and basically the literacy problems that we have in South Africa. That was a very interesting piece of the paper that I was not aware of. But, you know, in 2015, Moody's financial company rated South Africa as having the fastest growing green economy in the world. And that was based off of the procurements of the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Procurement Program, the REI4P. The fastest growing green economy in the world. And that was because of the massive success that had been achieved between 2011 and 2015 in the REI4P program. And what did we then promptly do? We then promptly stalled the power purchase agreements for 5 years of the companies that won in the last round of the REI4P, and completely obliterated the nascent renewable energy industry in South Africa. So wind turbine factories shut down, PV factories shut down, inverter factories shut down. We've done everything in our capacity in order to be able to undermine the industry, and we see it continuing to this day. You know, we make a big hoo-ha because of the fact that the president has announced that there is a 100 megawatt increase in up to 100 megawatts worth of power generation can be independently undertaken. A year and a half ago, that was 10 megawatts, right? And how many of those projects have we seen coming on so far? Zero, even ones that are already operating, because of the fact that the Section 34 determinations that are currently required in order to be able to feed into the grid are not being issued. It's not something that's being facilitated by the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy, because they have a fundamentally inimical attitude towards renewable energy. So when we go out there and we actively destroy our human capacity within the renewable energy sector, how can we then turn around and say, oh, but please, we need a handout in order to be able to protect us from the dangers of this just transition, when we in fact destabilize the jobs that we were busy making in the first place? A third point on that is that we continue to talk about, you know, the job protection capacity in this. We have 140,000 jobs in coal, and that's total. That's across coal mining, that's Eskom, Sasol, everybody combined, 140,000. We lost 279,000 jobs in the domestic worker sector last year as a result of COVID alone. We don't even blink when we see twice the amount of jobs disappearing, and we are not factoring in any of the other benefits. I mean, in this paper, I was very pleased to see that there is reference made to the fact that there is likely to be a net positive job implication. And certainly if you read the paper by the CSIR that I've put into the chat, you will see that they also agree with that position as well. But this is yet more of the rhetoric that we are perpetuating at a national level in order to be able to try and fuel this narrative that we're being hard done by transitioning over to renewable energy and to a cleaner future. There were a couple of other things that came into this as well. I've got quite a few comments, but I see I'm already like running at 10 minutes here. But so one of them is about the comment about decoupling. And yes, that's a very important facet of South African life. But we need to be cautious about taking this perspective that it needs to be held at a sort of individual level. This idea around the 800 million people who are responsible for 40% of emissions, and why don't we look at them directly as, you know, taxing those people independently or holding them to account. The issue here is, and I feel this very strongly, is that we have systemic issues. Martin, you mentioned when you were talking now about the fact that, you know, we need to look at landfill. Okay, let's look at landfill. So the landfill diversion, the waste diversion program that is being supported by the DBSA, that it's the waste diversion flagship is what it's called. That if they achieve their targets, they will manage to mitigate 600,000 tons of carbon dioxide from being emitted from our landfills nationally per annum. That's nothing. It's a drop in the ocean, first and foremost. Secondly, do you know how many commitments we've had around landfill diversion? We signed a Polokwane Declaration in 2001 that stated that we'd be a zero waste economy by 2020. Where are we now? We have more waste than we ever had before. The concept that 50% of South Africans will be engaging in waste separation by, I can't remember exactly what the date was that is stipulated in the paper. I don't see it happening. The overall uptake around that, I've done audits for various different municipalities around this. I did one for the city of Cape Town a few years ago. We're not seeing an uptake, not a significant uptake in the levels of household waste being mitigated from landfills. In fact, we are seeing the reverse. We're seeing an increase in the per capita waste being generated. I think really. So I mean, there are a number of things that I could refer to. I think some of the things around the carbon tax pricing. I'd love to see, for example, that we had differential pricing, because the carbon tax price itself. Look, Treasury estimates that it needs to be between 165 Rand to 433 Rand to be effective. I mean, we are the 5th most carbon intensive economy in the world per unit of GDP. I mean, we're behind Turkmenistan, Trinidad, Tobago, Uzbekistan, and I think Azerbaijan or something like that. It's insane. We need to find mechanisms in order to be able to decarbonize. Certainly, I think that the carbon tax is well designed. I agree with that statement. But I think one of the things that could really help is that the generation of carbon offsets in particular, particularly when it comes into the vulnerable sectors. So you made mention in your paper around the fact that adaptation is not something that is addressed in the paper. It has to be. It has to be something that is going to be addressed, because the reality is that even at 1.5 degrees warming, we're still going to see in Southern Africa, 3 degrees centigrade warming, right? That is absolutely critical. And how we use the carbon system in South Africa in order to be able to facilitate adaptation, firstly, but also on top of that, to meet the minister's own call for net negative emissions by 2050. That has to be something that is going to incorporate adaptation. So, and I really believe very strongly in this, that certainly at the current carbon pricing that we've got is woefully insufficient from an offset perspective in order to be able to finance anything that will look at removal credits in particular. So things like the climate neutral group, those act in terms of being able to facilitate adaptation, but they also facilitate mitigation as well. Or separated out from each other in totality. Yeah, so I think those are some of the main things that I wanted to do, except to say one last thing, and that's that I think
you there for a bit, Gray.
Yeah, okay. I hope you can hear me again, but so I wanted to make one last comment, and that is that honestly, I think that the politics of global carbon emissions are going to, if we rely on politics in order to be able to save us from the reality of our greenhouse gas and carbon budgets, we're doomed. And I think that the private sector recognizes that. And this is why it is that we're seeing entities like the MSCI carbon tracker coming into effect. With the TCFD and its incredibly rapid uptake, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. It is the 180% growth in environmental and social governance investment within the private sector over the last sort of 16 months. Into carbon pricing, over 700 large firms have brought in internal carbon pricing into their supply chains within the last 3 years alone. Most of them, I can actually share a slide on that as well. Most of them are in the developed world. And the reality is that while we sit here and we and ah about whose responsibility it is in order to be able to pick up the pieces around our rapidly eliminating carbon budget. By the way, we have 5 years and 8 months left in order to be able to meet the carbon budget for 1.5 degrees centigrade. It's not going to happen. So while we obviously umming and ahhing about that situation, we are finding that border carbon adjustments and internal carbon pricing are going to eliminate South Africa from being able to compete in export markets as they are for the rest of countries around the world. And the position of governments that oh, well, we need to be in a situation where we're financed in order to be able to protect our economies so that we can continue to be able to pollute, or that new finances in order to be able to transition is going to come at the cost of individual companies. We need to look beyond the state and start looking to the private sector and our own business activities in order to be able to shift the needle. Thank you.
Thank you, Gray. Thank you, Gray. That is a very useful response, I think, not only to Martin's paper, but I think to national and international developments as well. Please do share as many of the slides. We will certainly post them to all the links on this seminar as well on YouTube and the other online platforms. I'm not sure whether my point, there was maybe a misunderstanding there. So I still think that with more research on comparative comparative costs, that's the point there that I'm making, that we need that research to be there. It appears to me that from each side of the political debate, people are presenting various costs, various data, various estimates, various models, and then I think the accuracy of those estimates and data are important for us to understand and for them to be shared, so that the decisions made are less driven by fear, but more driven by the science. Basically, that's my point there. Other than that, I think that, we can open up to the audience now, and there you guys in the audience can please ask questions both to Martin as well as to Gray. And I am going to start off. Please just give me a minute. I'm trying to sift through the questions there for my colleagues. Benna Hugo, I think we've got way too many questions, so we're going to have to just go through them one by one, reading them. Benna Hugo instead says that instead of adding carbon tax to, say, Eskom, who will in the end pass this on to consumers, majority of whom are already constrained, is it not better to instead rely on policies that incentivize work from home, policies to reduce contribution from commuting, solar water heating system installations, or taking offices off the grid, etc., e.g. tax write-offs over a number of years? That's the first question with a comment there. I don't know, do you want, Martin and Gray, do you want me to read a couple of questions first, or we'll deal with each one at a time? Martin, what's your feel?
Read a few, yeah.
Read a few, okay, that's number one. Number two, Gray, this is from Tom Salmon. Gray, other countries also have seemingly rhetorically and effectively stalled in their shift away from a dirty energy economy. I'm thinking of Australia here, but do you think this kind of slow walking adaptation by misrepresenting it within policy measures is particularly unique, or is South Africa's position actually quite similar to that of other places? Okay, that was Thomas there. And then Steenkamp Lee N says, thank you, Martin and Gray, for an informative discussion. What is your take on the likelihood of a global carbon price being introduced? Okay, so I'll stop there for now. I'll start off with you, Martin, and then Gray in that order. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you very much, Gray. I'm sure you could have spent 4 times the amount of time. Thank you so much. Yeah, so well, maybe first, I mean, Gray, in terms of your input, fascinating. I mean, thank you. Expanding on what Nhlanhla was saying as well, I mean, it's really important, obviously, that research be well organized in this whole debate. I mean, there are hugely controversial, policy choices that have to be made. And as you point out, a lot of the change has to happen outside of government, and has to be driven by firms and individuals and civil society. But yeah, I mean, on this issue of the modeling, I would like to hear from you. The CSRR modeling that you referred to, is it publicly available? Because it sounds really important. I mean, you've shared slides, but I mean, in all of this type of work, one needs to be, the calculations, the details of the modeling must be public. Otherwise, it's very difficult to engage with it. And I must say, I mean, having looked at the 2014 mitigation report, I'm sure you would agree with me, it's very unsatisfactory. It's it's difficult to understand. It has a few weird assumptions, and you don't know why they're making those assumptions. And incidentally, yeah, that's one of the reports that says we need nuclear. So yeah, so I was wondering then about the status of that CSRR work. On the question around a global carbon price, in theory, that would be wonderful. If we were a better organized species, that's exactly what we would do. But we're not a well-organized species. Politics is very difficult. That Paris Agreement is a compromise upon compromise. We are not going to see a global carbon price unless the aliens invade and impose their government. We are not going to get a global carbon price. So there is going to have to be differentiation across countries. It's going to be very complex. Increasingly, it's going to make trade, international trade, very difficult. And we're going to have to live with that. And it's going to provide economists and consultants with a lot of work to do. And maybe, unfortunately, because of this complexity, one will need a lot of technical work. And then oh my goodness, now I've forgotten the third question in Ntlantla, but I think I've been looking through the questions as, oh yes, there's a question around, do we need to, increase Eskom's electricity prices? Can we not do things differently? Yeah, I think that obviously there's room for that. But if you look at the figures on how small residential emissions are, including residential emissions associated with residential electricity consumption, you realize how much is beyond our direct control. And therefore, one does need government policies, one does need big thinking, one does need powerful players, be it civil society, government, or firms, to take very decisive action. But that said, obviously there are things that we as individuals can do. We have control over certain things. Thank you. Ntlantla, I think I've answered the questions.
Okay, yeah, you've responded. I think the last one was directly addressed at Gray. So Gray, you please welcome to respond your reactions and insights to all of them. You can address all of them.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm going to comment on Martin's last point here about the issue around Eskom incurring the carbon tax and passing that on to consumers. Yeah, I mean, this is exactly what I was saying about systemic level issues. Like having a response where we try and put the onus on individuals in order to be able to try and I must have the most efficient light bulb. Meanwhile, per kilowatt hour of electricity, Eskom is producing, it's just over 1 kilogram per kilowatt hour of 1 kilogram of carbon dioxide per kilowatt hour, which is more than double the global average. So I can go out there and I can be as efficient as I like, but Eskom is still polluting as much as possible. And why are they doing that? They're doing it because we let them get away with it. Like in order for them to be able to meet their air emissions license requirements would have cost them an extra 250 million rand. And they said, oh, well, we can't incur that. But then they're happy to lose 19 billion rand in revenue over the last year. So and put us in a situation where we've got 400 billion rands worth of debt, you know. So it's we keep letting them get away with these kinds of things, and we need to stop. So that's one of the things. In terms of, like, you know, is South Africa unique in the fact that we have not exactly got the most ambitious targets? No, not by any means. I mean, like, I made a comment in there that's so if you ever go to the COP negotiations, civil society has a vote every day, actually. So it's about it's called the dinosaur of the day vote. And whichever government in the official negotiations chose the most backward negotiating position wins dinosaur of the day. And Australia wins a dinosaur of the day probably, you know, 2 out of 5 days. As far as the global carbon price, I am not sure I agree with you there, Martin. I think we'll see. I think that there might be a differentiated carbon price in terms of, like, there might be difference in carbon pricing between Annex 1 and Annex 2 countries. I'm going to share some slides in the chat thing now. But the NBI has just conducted some research, and they are putting the Annex 1 carbon price between $96 and $100 a ton by 2030. And similarly speaking, I'm just opening up the presentation now, and they anticipate that in developing countries, we would be at $40 a ton by, yeah. So in fact, I can actually show you this quickly. That is there. So, you know, so there is some very compelling research that's coming out now, and yeah, here we go. So this is the NBI's assessments, and I must say, I mean, I really like their overall outputs. But yeah, I mean, like, if we could get $90 a ton for carbon offsets or for, you know, carbon tax prices, that would be absolutely amazing. But yeah, I think that's what I've got to say about that. I'll see if I can share those slides in the attached.
Gray, the question around the status of the CSIR, I know it's from 2017. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm not sure. The person that I would need to connect you to would be Richard Halsey at Project 90 by 2030. I know he engaged extensively with the team at that time. Or the other person would be Jesse Burton at the ERC. So they would know as to the accessibility of that modeling. I can't remember which modeling tool was used.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important for, you know, this knowledge to go out, you know, to be available as widely as possible, and of course peer reviewed and etc. Yeah.
Martin, I think someone had a follow-up question there around the education. I don't know if Thomas can be. I think he asked about whether Martin would, and the question for Martin would be, what kind of research do you think is needed here within the field of education to drive change? So this is specifically about from the education sector.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I forgot. There was that question as well. This is kind of, yeah, certainly new territory for South Africa, but even elsewhere. The literature on how exactly education systems must respond with respect to two challenges is not that clear. Okay, the easier one is probably looking at specific skills. You know, in emerging industries, emerging energy sectors, and you know, if you look at our training plans, they do not adequately take this into account. And what's the result of that is going to mean it's more difficult for us to make these adaptations, and people are going to lose out on job opportunities. And that's unfortunate. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in education. I don't think we've even really started that. I don't think there is a South African report on how exactly does the challenge of climate change affect higher education and training. Then the other area where education has to respond, and this is a far more difficult area, is more at the basic level. So how does one create an awareness that is kind of constructive and informed in South Africa's very democratic environment? It's a societal issue, which is why it's so important to link these emissions policies to the question of South Africa's historical inequality, and so that we can see this as an opportunity to bring about a better society. And those linkages are mentioned here and there, but they're not clear enough, and then certainly not understood by, say, South Africa's teachers. Thanks.
Yeah, so there are a number of comments that have been made as we go along on the chat. For example, from Gavin there, talking about Australia, reiterating Gray's point. And then Tobias and John, I think these are the people that you just discussed now at the CSIR. The tool was used. The tool used was the same for ESCOM, same as ESCOM there. And thank you, Geraldine Morris, for the link that you've set up there. Yeah, so I think, colleagues, please do remember that Martin's paper is available online, and all the other slides and links that you've also shared on the chat there, we will post those alongside this discussion. Otherwise, I would really like to bring this to a close, and maybe I'm just going to ask Gray, do you have one last comment, and then Martin, and then we bring our discussion to a close. Gray?
Yeah, I just wanted to say thanks to everybody for joining in this afternoon and for paying an ear. It's, I think, really critical at this point in time that we start to put aside a lot of these politically motivated distractions that are sort of sidelining the real scientific outputs that should be informing our positions. You know, and really looking at the practical components of what it is that we need to achieve, because I think the politics of all of this is inevitably what will end up with us being in a situation where we have an uninhabitable world. We have to transcend the politics. Thank you.
Martin?
Thanks, Ntlantla, for organizing this event. Thanks, Gray, for very interesting inputs. And all of the questions, and yeah, I mean, we all need to do our bit to kind of get the knowledge out. And as Gray says, you know, we can't let politics dominate. We can't let emotion dominate. And to get that right, one needs to
and fear.
And fear. To get that right means really going through the information, knowledge, data we have as rigorously and as energetically as possible. Thank you very much.
Well, actually, we should be very fearful of if we don't do otherwise what we're supposed to do in terms of climate change. In any case, thank you so much, colleagues. Thanks to the presenters, Martin, really appreciated. Gray, really great insights. Really pleased and happy that you agreed to be a part of this discussion. To everybody who joined us this afternoon, we really appreciate it, and really thank you. Please follow us on our social media channels at Rhodes ISER. This recording will be made available with all the links and discussions, and we can continue the discussion there. Also, thanks to the ISER team for putting the event, another event together, and everybody have a great afternoon. I'm going to close. Thank you.